I'm very thrilled to welcome three amazing scholars also for the second part. But I wanted to give you a little bit of context. The exhibition also talks about or aims to talk about the fiction that is happening both in art and in fashion and in ritual, of course. So that's why we this second part of the symposium is a round panel about artifice in fashion, painting, and sculpture. We're going to start with Laura Beltrán-Rubio, who is a scholar whose work explores the construction of identity through fashion and art, but also on the legacies of colonialism in contemporary fashion systems. She has an MA in fashion studies from Parsons School of Design and currently is a doctoral candidate at the College of William and Mary and is also a professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá. Her presentation today is called The Artifice of Fashion, Creating and Performing Identities Through Clothing in Colonial Spanish America. Thank you, Laura, for joining us.
Thank you, Rosario. Let me share my screen. Okay. So thank you again, Rosario, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone at the Blanton Museum for organizing the symposium and the exhibition, which I am also very sad not to be able to see today or this week. And thank you to everyone at the Blanton Museum and to everyone who's here. So a portrait from the second half of the 18th century.
Sorry for interrupting, Laura. Can you please go to the upper part and click on the slideshow so we can see not your presenter's view, but the.
Are you seeing the presenter's view?
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter's view.
The other one. Sorry, I'm gonna.
I think if you would just go, yeah. Perfect.
I'm just gonna share again.
Thank you.
Sorry, 1 second.
It's okay.
Are you seeing the right one now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. Sorry. So a portrait from the second half of the 18th century depicts Doña María Rosa Rafaela de la Rea Urbena y Santa Coloma, Marquesa de Selva Alegre from Quito in present-day Ecuador, kneeling with her two youngest sons in front of an altar with an image of Virgin Mary and the Christ child. She is lavishly attired with a gown composed of layered skirts and the body is wrapped around a faja or sash made of a silky greenish-brown fabric with a red and blue floral motifs and voluminous semi-transparent sleeves with lace details. Rich jewelry complements Doña Rosa's outfit. Large earrings, layered chokers and necklaces, a trio of bracelets on each arm, and a pair of golden rings. Kneeling in front of the Marquesa are her two youngest sons. Joaquin, the youngest of them all, is clad in a bluish-white coat and an A-shaped skirt of the same fabric of his mother's gown, wrapped around the lower body and overlapping at the front. This skirt shares the structure of the faldellín, a type of skirt worn by girls in Spain that was also fashionable among the women of Quito in the second half of the 18th century, and which also resembles the limeño style of faldellín that we saw in James Middleton's talk this morning. Joaquin's outfit, in fact, illustrates the common practice of dressing boys and girls alike in early childhood until boys were breeched between the age of 4 and 7. On the Marquesa's left, Ignacio wears an ensemble typical of 18th century French male fashions, matching dark blue coat and breeches with a white lace trimmings, and the light brown waistcoat accessorized with a white linen cravat and flared cuffs of white lace. This same outfit is worn by his older brothers Juan Pío and Pedro, who sat for a separate portrait of their father and Doña Rosa's husband, Juan Pío de Montúfar y Fraso, the Marqués de Selva Alegre. In this portrait, the Marqués kneels in front of an altar depicting this time an image of the Virgin Mary with two angels holding her cape. He wears a dark brown coat with scrolling motifs at the chest, sleeves, and cuffs over a waistcoat made of silky white fabric, or perhaps silver fabric, with small multicolored floral motifs and lustrous brown buttons. He sports a white curled wig on his head, a white linen cravat around his neck, and ruffled lace cuffs at the wrists. A vara de justicia, or staff of office, held between his arm and his chest, symbolizes his status in Viceregal Quito. Alegre and their sons are representative of the elite portraiture in colonial Spanish America. The sitters wear their most fashionable attires adorned with luxuriant jewelry and are depicted surrounded by objects that demonstrate their status and wealth. These objects, including textiles, jewelry, and fashions, were sourced from the various trade routes that developed with early modern European exploration and suggest the sitters' access to and participation in global trade networks. Together with other portraits from the Spanish Americas, these images contain a wealth of information about the practices of colonial portraiture in the 18th century, where dress above all became the protagonist in elite performances of wealth, gender status, and honor. However, rather than being simple testaments of likeness, painted portraits were part of a constructed political performance of the viceregal elites. As such, portraits could be understood as mediators between the identities of the different inhabitants of the Spanish American colonies. This could be so even when the portraits were hung inside the homes of the individuals portrayed and those of their families. For, as art historian Maya Stanfield-Matsey has argued, colonial homes were semi-public spaces frequented by the extended families of the dwellers, business relations, political allies, free and enslaved servants, workers, and service providers of varied ethnicities and social echelons. Artists and tailors were, of course, among the many people who saw portraits even inside elite households. Artists were also important cultural mediators between the different sectors of the colonial Spanish Americas, especially as they moved in between social racial categories or castas that constituted the colonial social fabric. In painting portraits, they became key negotiators between the sitters and the rest of the colonial society, for they created stylized compositions that capitalized on the representation of fashionable dress to construct varied performances of luxury consumption in the different spaces of the viceroyalties. Rather than simply, quote unquote, pasting the faces of the sitters to copied foreign models, clad in European styles, portrait painters carefully fashioned representations of individuals that drew on the material realities of the sitters and their families. It is difficult to ascertain whether the garments and adornments depicted in portraits were representations of actual pieces worn by the sitters because of the scarcity of material evidence of historical fashion in the Spanish Americas. However, inquiry into surviving garments and textiles, archival documents, chronicles, and different narratives from the 18th century suggests that pictorial depictions of garments in portraits actually mirrored the material world of the sitters, and not just in portraits, but also in casta paintings on the image that I have here at the upper left corner. With their meticulous depictions of the details of dress, portrait painters in the Spanish American colonies became careful and dedicated historians, just as dress historian Eileen Ribeiro has argued for other, mostly European contexts. The interest in detailed depictions of contemporary fashion seems to have been one of the artistic innovations brought about by the 18th century. In fact, the advent of secular portraiture at this time is closely connected to the increasing importance of fashionable dress among different members of the colonial Spanish American societies. That contemporary scholars have chosen to call colonial elite portraits of ostentation is particularly telling, as it reveals the close connection between sitting for portraits with fashionable individuals in the 18th century. The word ostentation itself might be the key to understanding luxury fashion in late colonial Spanish America. In the 18th century Spanish world, the meaning of ostentation was built on early modern discourses on magnificence and sumptuosity. In the American colonies, it was also very closely related to the virtuous consumption of the Spanish elites. Yet, extant portraits evidence a wealth of shiny and luxurious materials that are strikingly different from the peninsular Spanish and other European portraits of the time. The choices of colonial sitters and artists in their depictions of fashionable dress suggest not just ostentation, but perhaps even sumptuous excess. The seemingly unbridled luxuries of the Spanish American elites can be explained by unraveling the specific meanings of luxury in the viceroyalties. And in Quito specifically, these developed at the interstices between Andean and European ideologies and were expressed through a set of dress choices that departed at times significantly from contemporary European styles. Through its focus on ostentation, portraiture in late colonial Quito became an important vehicle for sitters to claim their right to luxury and fashion more than simply asserting their status. Portraits in this context were fashionable and political at the same time. And although I'm focusing on Quito today, I do bring some images from other parts of the Spanish Americas, and maybe some of my arguments can be extended to other contexts within the colonial Spanish Americas. That fashion and portraiture have developed simultaneously in the 18th century Spanish Americas has also led to a common practice of interpreting portraits and other paintings as unbiased testaments of changing colonial fashionable attire. Modern scholars and again other visual representations of dress at face value or as evidence of the adoption of European fashions among the colonial Spanish American elites and sometimes even of members of other social racial categories. These accounts the differences in style, which can be very subtle at times, with arguments about the lack of prowess of colonial artists, tailors, and dressmakers, or with an apparent lag in the transmission of fashionable styles. But what much of the fashion historiography of the colonial Spanish America seems to have ignored is the possibility that innovations in dress might have emerged at the borderlands and thresholds allowed by the fluidity of social racial categories and the resulting social mobility that became increasingly common as the 18th century progressed. Also absent from this scholarship is a critical analysis of the detailed depictions of dress, which were of capital importance in the creation and efficacy of elite portraits and pictures of types. It must be recognized that portraits showcase worn by the colonial elites and failed to paint a wider picture of the dress worn by the different inhabitants of the viceregal societies, and even that of the elites in their everyday lives. While attempts at understanding the dressing practices of the lower sorts through visual representations offered by casta paintings, which I'm showing here, have been made, the artist's strategies of representation need to be considered when analyzing these other pictures of types as evidence for the writing of fashion history. And more importantly, the many divergences between fashions depicted in colonial portraits and contemporary European portraits need to be critically analyzed. The three styles most commonly worn by European elite women throughout the 18th century were the robe à la française, the robe à l'anglaise, and the robe à la polonaise. The outfit worn by the Marquesa de Selva Alegre is European fashionable styles. In fact, the Marquesa's gown seems to be an expression of fashion that was likely endemic to South America and would have been foreign to Europeans at the time. The layered design of the sleeves recalls the attire of archangels in religious paintings. Dressed figures in religious paintings, including virgins, saints, and archangels, were arguably attired in what would have been considered the height of luxury at the time. And we do see sometimes some correspondences between the textiles worn or with which virgins and saints are portrayed and the textiles with which elite women are portrayed. And it is not surprising that elite colonial portraiture in general drew on representations of textiles in really adopted elements such as high quality, often imported fabrics, lace, metallic threads, fine jewelry, flowers, and feathers. Other portraits of the time evidence that several women in Quito and its surroundings also self-fashioned themselves in outfits that suggest the adoption of local, perhaps indigenous elements of dress and ideas about luxury and fashion. For example, Doña María Josefa Aguada, a female donor portrayed kneeling in front of an image of the Virgen del Quinche on the left, wears a black dress with loose hanging sleeves that recall those in the portraits of the Marquesa de Selva Alegre, although they are not exactly the same. In two additional paintings, Doña Margarita Carrión y Vaca, Marquesa de Miraflores, and María Josefa de Velasco y Vallejo, wear a different local style of dress that includes a bodice with round collar made of rich floral brocades complemented with fine lace details. The Marquesa de Miraflores portrait indicates the wearing of skirt called faldellín. What is most notable about their shared style is the rounded silhouette of the abdomen, which suggests the absence of boned cotillas or stays, or what we now recognize more often as corsets. While stays were rigidly worn in most of Western Europe at the time, their absence seems to have been relatively widespread in Quito, and the trend was possibly founded on Andean ideas about the female body. This peculiar style of dress poses questions about the transmission of indigenous fashions and tastes in the viceroyalties and their adoption by fashionable elite women of Spanish descent, who got to see fashionably dressed individuals certainly marked in relation to how bodies were perceived, especially in this multi-ethnic society where different cosmologies and ways of knowing and seeing coexisted. The status and social racial category of individuals, especially as they were perceived by others, were determinant forces in defining who had the right to luxury and in turn to fashionable dress. Portraits were constitutive in communicating and perhaps even establishing predominant discourses about fashionability in relation to dress, to race, ethnicity, and status in colonial Quito. As a result, the performance of elite identities through fashionable dress in life events in the viceregal courts and cities was just as important as it was in portraits hung inside elite homes. The fashionability of the individuals was, in all cases, meant to be seen and responded to, especially as painted images acted as a sort of reinforcement of elite power and prestige in the actual cities. However different from European fashions, the details of dress in colonial Quiteño portraiture and other Spanish American portraits reveal wider ideas about luxury, honor, gender, and status in a rigidly structured society that, in the case of Quito, developed at the conjunction of two similarly hierarchical cultural groups. Both Spaniards and Andeans valued textiles and clothing as vehicles for the separation and classification of individuals into echelons that conformed their societies. A critical analysis of fashion and luxury in portraits from colonial Spanish America must therefore questions about the social cultural negotiations and power dynamics that took place between patrons, artists, and the diverse members of this particular society. Only then will the study of fashion history reveal shared attitudes toward art, luxury, and the performances of fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We're again going to wait for the questions, but it was fantastic. Now we're going to go to Marta Sandoval presentation. She's an art historian and fashion scholar, currently finishing her PhD at la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and teaching at the Instituto Tecnológico de Estudios Superiores de Occidente. As one of the founding members of the Seminario de Estudios sobre Indumentaria y Modas de México, she has published extensively on garments of all kinds, from Spanish dress to the history of indigenous huipiles. And I'm going to share my screen with her presentation. Sorry.
Thank you, Rosario. Thank you to Rosario Granados and the Blanton Museum for inviting me and I want to offer an apology in advance for my bad English. You are what you wear. Portrait and social fabric in New Spain. Design of frieze silks. All the skilled workers are to make garments for Aaron for this consecration, so he may serve me as a priest. There are the garments they are to make: a breastpiece and an ephod, a robe, a woven tunic, a turban, and a sash. They are to make these sacred garments for your brother, Aaron, and his son, so they may serve me as a price. Have them use gold and blue purple and scarlet yarn and fine linen. Exodus. If they are to dress, because, after all, they were born poor and naked, it must be with frills, silk brocaded, tissue, and the richest clothes. Finally, will you not tell me what all this magnificence is of these well-grown men who so richly adorn their persons and all of their houses? What can it be? That they are lords and they make it known. That they are lords and there is no one to for another lords. Francisco de la Concepción Barbosa. The quote above speak about sumptuary dress. The first one is God's order to the Jews, according to which Aaron and henceforth all priests shall dress in a rich manner in exciting the accessing the priesthood, while the second quantitation comes from a Lance sermon given in 1735 in Mexico City, criticizing the excesses in the lifestyle of the wealthy and denouncing the luxury they lavished upon their person. Both references mention rich fabrics, which is the subject over which we are gathered here today. Divine worship demands the richest ornaments, since these ornaments adorn the space in which Christ will become present in the Eucharisties, and the same went for the person of the priest in his role as mediator in Catholicism's most sacred rite. On the other hand, luxury among civilians will be constantly persecuted by civil and religious power alike. Dressing means much more than merely covering the body. It is part of a complex array of social meaning. Today, I want to talk about dress as an identified sign in society and about its importance in rites of passage and other important social events. Dress was turned into a sign, and its use establishes a new condition of the individual involved. The most significant occasion in the Catholicism is the taking of priestess robes. The subjects of Andrés de Islas, San Ildefonso taking the chasuble, Ildefonso as a faithful defender of Maria's perpetual virginity was rewarded with an apparition of the Virgin, and, so the story goes, the Mother of Christ granted him an valuable present, speaking these words to him: "Accept this present that I have taken from my son's treasure. This glorious dress that shall adorn you in this life, you will also enjoy in the afterlife, together with other servants of my son." In this iconography, the heavenly chasuble is a sign and it transforms Ildefonso into a beginning that has been visibly exalted by God by means of the divine chasuble, which changes Ildefonso's status, turning an early priest into a saint in eternity. On the other hand, the taking of the veil for nuns is an important rite of passengers that involve dress. This is a significant event in which a novice lives her worldly life behind a renuncious earthy dress, undergoing a visibly bodily transformation with her hair beginning cut and her taking of a nun's robes as a Christian bride. This is the subject of the painting Luis Berrueco's Profesión de Santa Clara. The painting shows the future nun wearing a luxurious mantua dress. She will be relieved behind Claire, young woman carrying the austere robes of the religious order that she is about to take. Wearing luxury dress at such an occasion was standard. At the very least, the nun to be wore to very best she could afford. As proof of this, let's consider Micaela Josefa Malo de Villavicencio's taking on holy orders at the Carmen Convent in Mexico City. On that day, she wore a dress made on fine red velvety cloth with gold tissues and Milan fringes, were over 1,000 pesos, which was then gifted for the purpose of making ornaments for the temple, on account that it was made of precious clothes. The description is that of a super dress, a fact that is confirmed by a statement of how much it cost and by the public accession of the gift as a clear manifestation of the family's wealth and Christian charity, which is also an affirmation of social status. On the other hand, it shows how rich clothes could be used both for dressing and for divine worship. Furthermore, portraits were used by wealthy families to preserve the image of the young woman who had left the paternal house, with the painting becoming a substitution of the sorts of their physical presence, one of the functions of the portrait. With an emphasis of the display, the rich vestments subtly an accurate portrayal of what she wore on the day she renounces the war, symbolized by changing into the order's robes. This is the reason this genre of painting became fairly common, and why today we have many portraits of young women of New Spain. While social mobility was almost non-existent in the Iberian Peninsula, it was possible in the New World. A few fortunate ones found wealth after some years or generation of hard work at honest and not so honest business. Aside from financial status, there sought social prestige, and the most immediate and evident way of advertising the attainment of wealth was a change in the way of dressing. There is a Mexican saying that approximately goes like this: you will be treated in accordance to the way that you look. Another one states, appearing to be wealthy was as important as actual wealth. Success should be boldly worn made visible to all. There were relatively few nobility titles all the way into the 17th century, as most of them will be graded in the 18th century. A noble ancestry will therefore be rare, forcing the wealthy in New Spain to look for exchanges for gaining prestige and status. Portraiture was an element that contributed to the attainment of his goal, and Mexico was a fertile ground for this January during the 18th century. Portraits usually display decent merit, religiosity, culture, office scale, or noble coats of arms. And one of the most visible elements was dress, through which the subject of the portraits could be recognized as gentleman, bishop, university official, etc. Personal imaging was carefully constructed through a representation of the very best items of dress and therefore of the best materials. Today, I want to draw your attention to wrought silk as seen in this work. So, just for today, I shall not talk about the form of dress items and will restrict myself to speaking about wrought clothes, especially that which displays designs. The style of fashionable wrought silks used in Spain was highly aesthetic and may be seen through the painting of New Spain. La Dama con Rebozo, Lady with a Child, attributed to Juan Rodriguez Juarez, is from its beginning interesting because of its uniqueness and beauty, requires a further language through who and doubled seal, which is hardly perceptibly and illustrates a facsimile of perhaps Baroque style that was used approximately between 1690 and 1720s. The further that stand out in these styles are its surprising exotism with a very long design or rapport, with rolling motifs and asymmetrical flowers pattern, with a plain or damask background clothes. In addition, the portraits of Rosa Maria Isabel Rojas Sandoval, 1728, seemed to me not to have been able to successfully represent the clothes, thereby preventing us to determine what its silk design was. But an old photograph gives evidence of the so-called Louis XIV Ordinale style. This design is distributed around a main symmetrical motif and displays some lattice with rolls and flowers of different size. It was used between approximately 1695 and 1735, although it can be found through most of the century. The best example of detail can be seen in the portrait of Ignacia de Aslor y Echeves, 1730. Although I consider that two ladies of the Faguaga family the other, please.
This one?
Yes, thank you. Two ladies of the Faguaga family also wear this type of fabric. These silks are located in the inventories of goods from the New Spain under the name Persiana. The Marquis of Vallameno spent the following months in 1763 189 pesos, 6 reales, for braiding and persiana cut with golden flowers. These styles enjoyed wide accepted in Mexico. Between 1732 and 1745, so-called naturalistic clothes were popular. These displayed exuberant and bulbous plant motif combined with everyday essence, baskets, and cornucopia, which were regularly diminutive in comparison with nature. Gradually, lettuces, fringes, larid fringes, will be added. It is very pictorial style with the expensive use of dégradé, thanks to the invention of point rentrée, which allowed for a fading effect. The powerful of New Spain favored these exuberant clothes, as can be observed in the portrait of the Faguaga family, in which some of these members display various silks in these styles, which incidentally were among the most expensive ones. In the same vein, in the portrait of the Pedro Cebrián, Count of Fuenclara, the viceroy of dresses in the natural motif chupa, vest, the masculine item of clothing that regularly exhibits pattern and silk, although not exclusively, it is very difficult to identify the kind of silk is the inventories of goods, give the fact that the descriptions are very succinct, but two cuts for masculine garment, one's made of red cloth and the other the color of Florete Spring from England, which was recorded in 1799, seems to correspond to the naturalistic style. In another vein, the Rococo style will attain a width accepted and can be found in several portraits, such as the one of the girl Ignacia Dionisia de Ibargoyen y Miguelena, which presents a garment of silk that lends continuity to the naturalistic style, but with an abundance of undulating lace stripes. This style is also called meander, with vertical and diagonal strips and leathers interlaced with flowers, fruits, leopard skins, which occasionally combine with small architectural scenes. A couple of painted silks imported that had been recognized by Jesus Pérez Morera in real garments belong to this style, thus such as the tissue represented in the portrait of María de la Luz Padilla, with which a dress for Our Lady of the Conception was fashioned at the La Laguna, Tenerife. The Rococo style, asymmetrical meander, is displayed in both cases with color variation. I take this opportunity to say that it was standard to have the same design made in various hues. Pérez Morera also found a priestly ornament in gold lampazo from Lyon, France, in the church of St. James Apostle in Realejo Alto, Tenerife, with the same clothes that can be seen in the portrait of Sor María de la Sangre de Cristo, faithfully painted by José de Alcíbar in 1777. In the last third of the century, clothes suffered the same fate as art and acquired a neoclassical aesthetic. Clothes for garments stress both minimalism and a reduced scale of their motif. That the trend towards vertical striping that had a period at the end of the Rococo period, as well as the gallards and bouquets were reduced to the minimum, and as a result, it will be plain or straight background clouds that will dominate over decorative motif. Excuse me.
Tenemos que apurarnos un poco, perdón.
Okay. Masculine attire will be used silk velvet with miniature motif or striped velvet with different hues and best made of embroidery satin. We have seen painting clothes yet wearing the different kinds of clothes and art form in themselves. The complex technical and the fine materials used is making them unattainable for most people, but I wish to mention design as a fundamental art for this creation, as most arts best beginning with drawing the fashionable of seeing produces group of men and women dedicated exclusively to creating luxurious bizarro clothes, sensuous naturalistic patterns, or dancing meanders. Outside of Europe, cloth was also sourced from the Far East, although these are very difficult to identify since they copy European signs, while the opposite ways also true. They are abundant in documents, but they are rarely and unequivocally physical. Identify is a manner that admits to no doubles, such as is the case with the cape in the Museo Nacional de Historia. On the other hand, in the Spanish, there existed manufacturers of rich silks, as attested in some commissioned by the Mexico and Puebla cathedrals. As has been said, a whole mosaic of infinitive designs of silk was created during the 18th century, but rather that thinking thus produced and merchandise, as the case of the usually boom, the case lays with demand, as Daniel Roche has concluded. Fashion is fierce and foremost a revolution by consumers. It is individual that desire novelty and industry repose to their desire in Mexico. It was said that vanity made people wait to see what the ship bringing, and the moment was also announced when the China ship arriving in Acapulco. America's Spanish real became the booty of trade. Permits for legally doing trade with New Spain were negotiated during the wars, with the permits granted to ship to allow them to a crop another each year at Veracruz, bringing a certain volume of cargo. There's limit, of course, were...
Perdón, te tengo que interrumpir porque si no, no tenemos tiempo para la presentación de Leslie. I'm so sorry, but el trabajo estaba más largo, entonces te pido una disculpa, pero volveremos para darle oportunidad a Leslie y poder hacer la presentación. I was apologizing to Martha for interrupting her this very rude way, but as a moderator, I need to allow Leslie time for her presentation. Leslie Todd is assistant professor of art history at Sewanee, the University of the South. She received her PhD in art history from the University of Florida, Gainesville, and her research focuses on wooden polychrome sculpture dating to the second half of the 18th century from Quito, Ecuador, a major center for sculpture making in the Spanish Americas. Her presentation today is called The Brilliance of Brocateado of 18th Century Sculpture in Quito. Thank you, Leslie.
Can you see my screen okay? Okay. I just want to begin by saying thank you to everyone involved in the organization of this event, particularly to Rosario for inviting me to participate, and Justin for all of her behind the scenes work. I'm not only grateful to be a participant, but also to have the opportunity to bring Quito sculpture into these wider conversations. So I really appreciate that Rosario thought about that and reached out to me for this. Visual references to fine textiles adorning wooden polychrome sculpture, either in the form of actual textile items or painted directly on the surface of the figure, as I'm showing you here, was common practice across Spanish and Spanish American sculpted religious figures. In the catalog that accompanies the painted cloth exhibition, Patricia Diaz-Calleros examines the history of dressing sacred figures as it was interwoven with devotional practices. With a focus on small-scale 18th century sculpture produced in the colonial capital of Quito and destined for the domestic sphere, in this presentation, I build on her work by narrowing the focus to examine the surface treatments manipulated to appear like lavish garments through the use of brocateado. Brocateado refers to the technique painters used on both painting and sculpture to represent brocades, rich fabrics woven with a pattern, typically using gold or silver-wrapped thread. This technique was commonly employed across Quiteño corpus, as seen here in the Denver Art Museum's St. Joseph and angel figures. I ask, what visual effect did the artifice of brocateado textile designs contribute to sculpture, and what significances did they convey, particularly in the domestic context? So I'm thinking about artifice as in terms of how Rosario introduced our roundtable, thinking about the fiction of artifice in this sense as a visual device on the surface of sculpture. One key visual impact of the brocateado is how the design highlights the materiality and physicality of the figures. Materiality is immediately expressed through the use of gold as a highly valued resource tied to imperial expansion and prosperity. Meanwhile, the floral design likely signals that the textiles represented are the most commonly brocaded type of the period, silk. As Maya Stanfield-Mazzi points out in her book, Clothing the New World Church, silks, particularly those imported from Asia, were highly appreciated as luxury items and stood for excess and sensuality. The luxury and materiality of gold and silk brocades ties the religious figures, in this case of what I'm showing you, St. Joseph and Angel, to this, our physical world, and 18th century human experiences with sumptuous materials. Furthermore, the technique of the brocateado emphasizes the physical objectness of the sculptures. As seen across these examples, brocateado designs on Quiteño figures can range in complexity from very tight interlacing and multicolored vines, as seen on the Angel and Virgin of the Immaculate Conception examples to the right, to loose stamp-like floral patterns, as seen in St. John the Evangelist and St. Isidore the Laborer to the left. While patterning was also traditionally created on sculptures rendering of textiles through estofado, by the 18th century, it was replaced by the brocateado technique in Quito. Brocateado is similar to estofado, given the way gold is used to convey various types of patterns, yet it is bolder and does not underlay the paint. As seen in these 17th century Quiteñan examples of a praying figure and King Baltasar, estofado patterns tend to blanket the surface of sculpture in extremely fine lines, created with a pointed tool like a burin. These examples show tight, delicate striations to render horizontal lines and circles. Brocateado, by contrast, sits on the surface of sculpture, conveying looser, organic designs. Although brocateado designs can be quite delicate, because it is applied with a brush rather than the thin point of a burin, the lines are distinctively thicker than those used to convey estofado, and therefore less subtle in the visualization of pattern. The technique and resulting texture of brocateado plays an important role in grounding the physicality of the images in our earthly realm. Despite the differences in complexity of brocateado designs across sculpted examples, they all convey a raised texture due to the use of the masa beneath the gold paint that creates a subtly elevated relief. This presents a consistent finish across the representation of clothing that emphasizes the surface quality of the figures, which is absent in works with estofado that instead appear very flat. The brocateado keeps the figures rooted in our human experience as it evokes sensuality through touch and artfully suggests the shifting smoothness of brocaded designs on actual textiles. It likewise draws our attention to the virtuoso touch of the painter and the decorative quality the designs contribute to the figure as a sculpted art form. The way the gold surface interplays with light adds a luminescent dynamism to the three-dimensionality of the object, drawing our attention to every facet and angle of the figures, depending on how and where the light falls. At the same time, the use of gold in brocateado carried a second, equally important visual effect and significance, that of conveying spiritual ideals tied to brilliance. The iridescence of the gold of the brocateado in either low or full light contributed to the spiritual effectiveness of the religious figures, which carried diverse meanings tied to reflection and brilliance. The sumptuous quality of the gold and the light it emitted transformed the sculpted image from an inanimate object into an otherworldly, numinous vision that performed the sculpture's divine appearance through splendor. This is especially apparent when light is directed at the figures in a dim setting. In 2016, I led a small experiment at the Denver Art Museum in which members of the New World Department staff and I used low lighting in imitation of candles to discern how sculptures would have appeared in the 18th century home at night or in a dim room lit only by candlelight. As seen here, the reflection of light on brocateado emits a radiant sparkle and glow. Along with the sheen of the Encarnacion and silver adornments, the gold of the brocateado enhanced the visual impact of a single sculpture as something that was not only illuminated by light, but was itself light-giving. The importance of this luminescence on sculpture is underscored across other art forms. In this 18th century ex-voto that depicts the miraculous recovery from illness of Doña Maria Luisa Exteripa, Quiteñan artist Vicente Alban recreates this quality of the sculpture as the source of light in the room. He depicts a radiating halo of warm golden yellow surrounding and emanating immediately from the sculpture of Our Lady of El Quinche before it dissolves outward into heavenly blue sky and clouds. The glow of the light on sculpture endowed figures with a dazzling brilliance that presented them as celestial beings. In this specific case for Doña Maria Luisa, Our Lady of El Quinche is transformed into a benevolent figure capable of intervening to save the life of her devoted follower. The spiritual importance of such radiance is grounded in the Christian understanding of light, specifically in reference to God's holy light and Christ as lux mundi, or the light of the world. The brilliance of reflective surfaces and use of gold also had indigenous spiritual interpretations. The Inca used gold and other reflective surfaces to signal the celestial and divine, while other pre-Hispanic groups in the northern and coastal regions of modern-day Ecuador likewise applied spiritual symbolic meanings to reflective surfaces. Art historian Isabel Oleas Mogollon identifies how those indigenous meanings carried forward into the colonial period and coexisted with Christian symbolic interpretations of gilded and reflected materials in the Church of La Compañía in Quito. She concludes that the overlapping spiritual interpretations of light-reflecting surfaces and objects represented in the overwhelming splendor of La Compañía's interior served as a, quote, helpful tool to link Christian and indigenous traditions, end quote, even as late as the 18th century, as well as an important sacred space in the city that was, quote, an embodiment of the divine for the whole colonial audience, end quote. It is likely that spiritual aesthetics of brilliance carried beyond the walls of the sacred space and into the diverse homes across Quito in the 18th century, especially considering the fact that indigenous citizens of Quito counted themselves among the owners of these prized local objects. In fact, the testaments of two women who identify themselves as India in the notarial record illustrate discrete choices to describe the shining features associated with their devotional figures, which are extra details that were not always included in the typical testament or inventory according to the notarial template. Romualda Paredes' testament identifies a silver halo with 3 rays on her Christ child figure, while Doña Maria Cusimina's testament, which I'm showing you here, specifically notes the gilding and Encarnacion on a figure of St. John, perhaps similar to the figure that introduced this presentation, which I'm showing you here. While these features identify the women's economic abilities to afford these items, especially in the case of Paredes, who adorned her figure with a silver crown, they also indicate that the women valued and cultivated brilliant surfaces in the display of their sculptures in their homes. I now return to a consideration of the relationship the domestic figure supported within the real physical world to suggest a third, and for the purpose of this presentation, final effect of the artifice of textile designs on sculpture. Through their display choices and ritual devotional practices, owners cultivated an atmosphere and intimate spiritual viewing experience that reflected the practices and display techniques surrounding religious sculpture in churches. This increased sculpture's spiritual qualities and ultimately ensured the effectiveness of the imagen de bulto as a devotional image in their residences. The visual references to silk brocades on sculpture played an important role to connect the religious aesthetics of the home directly to the visual rhetoric of the church. As Stanfield Mazzi demonstrates in Clothing the New World Church, cloth was a key material object in communicating the sacrality and authority of the Catholic Church. While specific liturgical garments expressed church hierarchy and empowered priests to say Mass and perform other sacraments in an expression of their ability to access the divine, different types of vestments on a richly dressed altar played an important role in upholding the decorum of rituals for the correct delivery of those sacraments. The favored textile type, Stanfield Mazzi explains, was silk brocades. This textile phenomenon continued into the devotional space of the home, as the Alban painting demonstrates. Not only is the figure of Our Lady of El Quinche dressed in a striking bright red and gold brocaded garment, but it also sits on an altar adorned with a sumptuous altar cloth made of polychrome brocade and gold ribbons, similar in its 3-part construction to the silk brocade chasubles priests wore. Actual silk brocades used to dress sculpture, as well as the brilliance of brocateado on figures, connected the sanctity and authority of domestic figures to that of the church, not only validating their devotional use in the home, but also importantly connecting domestic spaces to the religious institutional spaces across Quito. By way of conclusion, I now draw together the material, spiritual, and religious effects of brocateado. The Spanish Catholic Church promoted the private ownership of images, centering them at the core of the personal, intimate religious experience based on their ability to facilitate the viewer's connection to the divine. Images made that connection possible because they were understood to act as a gateway, channel, or interface, making visible, material, and, in the case of sculpture, physical, what was invisible. The design of textiles on sculpture, particularly the technique of brocateado, played the important visual task of artifice in suspending the figures between the material worldly realm and the spiritual otherworldly realm, between fiction and reality, in its devotional role as a gateway. This worked for and connected the viewer across Quito's diverse society, from Spanish and Creole elites like Doña Maria Luisa, who was the wife of the president of the Audiencia at the time, to indigenous owners like Romualda and Casimina. While doing the same work for all viewers in the home, the brilliance of brocateado offered the flexibility of diverse interpretations. Stanfilmazzi explains that silk brocades, especially those imported from Europe and Asia, were relatively quick to replace local Andean-made tapestries in churches in the Viceroyalty of Peru, given the suspicion of idolatry potentially associated with the latter. However, on sculpture, the use of gold to create brocateado patterning as a visual device that imitated silk brocades allowed for potential indigenous spiritual interpretations that actual silk brocades were intended to deny through their foreign origins. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Leslie. I think there's a lot of things that we can say. I'm going to ask now Marta and Laura to join us with their cameras on, so we can actually start this conversation. I just want to start with this phrase, the Mexican saying that Marta mentioned, that you will be treated in accordance to the way you look, because it is indeed what we're discussing here. The way fabric is being portrayed is what is causing this exhibition and this conversation that we're having today. And I just want to start with one idea that hit me when it's not idea that hit me now, but it makes sense also in the exhibition. This dialogue that happens between different media when the cloth is being depicted. Now in the galleries we have a couple of Cusco paintings close to estofado sculpture from Guatemala, and I always thought, by looking at those objects together, that the paintings that are so well known for the brocateado applied on the canvas was not only a depiction of the fabrics, but it was a depiction of the fabric of the sculpted fabrics. And I just think it's something similar is happening with in the civil portraits. No, it's not only a depiction of a real object, but of it's mediated by other media. I don't know if you agree. I don't know if we can complicate the conversation of what artists were trying to portray. I think the three presentations made a clear case that the fabrics were real. The detailed description that Marta you made about how artists were portraying very specific pieces of cloth make the case, but also Laura, you also were very clever in saying we don't know if these objects existed as such, but we know that the materiality, the goal was to show these objects, in order to construct the social persona of these individuals. But so I'm putting many things on the table, maybe, but this idea, if we can explore this idea of sculpture influencing painting, and garments being portrayed from real pieces of fabric, but elaborating from there. So they're both fiction and reality. Maybe that's no, but if you want to start there until we get more questions from our audience.
I definitely think that's an interesting way of thinking about the artworks being in dialogue with one another, because something that I've been thinking a lot about is how, and I kind of briefly referenced this in my presentation, is how the sculptures in the home is kind of creating a dialogue between the domestic space and the church. So kind of creating a dialogue and a connection between spaces. And I think it's interesting to see how that could also potentially be reinforced across a community by creating a dialogue between materials and media. And I think it's entirely relevant, especially given the colonial period and urban communities in a place like Quito, where, especially in the late colonial period, kind of establishing identity as a local community and as a unique kind of urban community. Like all of those dialogues and connections kind of solidifying their connection to place and space and kind of a local community were all really important, especially kind of in the later colonial period, as we see these local identities kind of rising with criollismo and all of that.
Me disculpan que voy a hablar en español. Para mí, y esto creo que lo tengo muy claro, la imagen de una persona es su representación en la sociedad. Y el retrato es a su vez la representación de esa persona para los objetivos que el retrato haya sido creado. En ambas representaciones, que es una representación de la representación, está involucrada la adscripción del individuo a su lugar en la sociedad y al papel que éste juega en ella, o bien al lugar al que desea alcanzar.
Let me translate because you're going into deeper grounds, waters. Marta is saying that the portrait is not only it's a double representation. It's and maybe Laura or Leslie, you can help me translate if I'm missing something. But it's a representation not only of the person, but also of what this person is trying to convey and where this person is trying to go. So it's a double layer, no, a double process of what is happening, which I think it's fascinating to think portraiture in that way, no, because and I think in that way is when we are finally achieving being critical with portraits as documents, no, that we tend to think that they are snapshots of a moment in time. But what you're saying, Marta, is fantastic because it's more complicated than that, no? Sigue y yo te traduzco.
Y el papel, yo he encontrado que el papel que las sedas jugaron fue más importante, bueno, no solo las sedas, cualquier tipo de tela representada y física fue más importante de lo que hoy en día alcanzamos a percibir, porque lo tenemos todos los días. Era súper complicado hacerse de un ajuar digno para jugar en esta representación. Entonces encontramos en los inventarios de bienes y en los cargamentos que llegan del extranjero, que es mucho más difícil encontrar lo que ocurre en la producción local, un enorme interés y asimismo un afán por estar moderando ese desbordamiento por esa lo llama Francisco de la Concepción Barbosa, esa locura por vestir esas telas. Hay otro sacerdote que dice que van a perder el cielo por un pedazo de tela.
Marta was saying that something that I think is also very important, that we now do not appreciate how difficult was to get all these fancy silks and other kinds of fabrics, because we tend to have them because of the access we now have to them, but because or through inventories and other documents, we have knowledge of that extra value, no, that was embedded in these fabrics. And she's referencing to a couple of friars who complained or told about how people were willing to give up salvation and heaven or access to heaven just to get some of this material wealth. And Laura, I don't know if you want to say something.
Yes, well, I'm just thinking about the methodological question, I think, which is something that I pointed to during my very brief talk, but it's something that I've been thinking about for years, because I think sometimes we see, and especially I think from art historical perspectives, that we kind of understand portraits as these testaments of different things, but in this specific case of fashion. But then we don't know to what extent these portraits depict the sort of the likeness of the people, the reality, or how they actually looked like and how they actually dressed, and especially how they dressed for the different moments of their lives. But then I do think that we can approach that or part of that by kind of piecing together a sort of like puzzle with all of these different media and all of these like fragments of information that we have. And I think it's very valuable. It's difficult, but it's very valuable to bring together not just the archival documents that Marta was mentioning, not just inventories or like tax lists, things like that. But then also, even if we bring together, for example, liturgical textiles together with the portraits, with images of saints, with the sculptures, and with archival documentation, and even narratives like chronicles and things like that. When you start bringing all of that together, you kind of get a better picture of what the material reality could have been like and what fashion could have been like. And I think that, at least for me, is the biggest potential of bringing all of these views together and all of these media together as well.
And I think at the end, no, in terms of method, I think it's recreating the visual culture and the material culture that was surrounding these objects, no, because we only have a little evidence of that, no. But in order to recreate, or if we want to grasp the meaning of these objects, then the more comprehensive our view can get, then we're going to be able to understand them more. And I think it's well, that's the goal of what we do from our different perspectives, no? But what I think it becomes very evident in the three presentations is this in-betweenness, no, between reality and fiction, which we are not normally comfortable with. No, but as your research has shown, and the presentations we saw this morning, I think it's there where the depiction actually lives. No, and also I think the other element, and linking the conversation to Elena Phipp's presentation this morning, no matter if it's religious or if it's a civil environment, the light that textile produced and share was crucial, no, because I just love the experiment that you share with us, Leslie, because I always think on the chasubles no, that were, as you were talking about, no, the reflection. So just imagining how iridescence, which is not something as crucial for us today, was really vital in both the actual fabrics, no, as Elena mentioned this morning, but also in the representation of those, no, light really, no, with all this religious weight that Marta just talked about, no, but in your painting, the first painting that you show, Laura, the candles are so, you know, important, and the environment, it's also very vital in that sense.
And I have actually looked at those paintings, Laura, in my own research to try and understand kind of what the original viewing experience would have been. And you know, whether it was in a dim setting or a light setting, you know, whatever time of day it was that they were going into the oratory to pray, at least in their case, having an oratory and being very wealthy, candles are always present. And so it's very clear that candlelight and kind of thinking of the flicker of the flame and how that kind of enlivens the either painting or sculpture. And so light was so important in relationship to all of these objects.
Yes, definitely. And I think in relation to the clothes as well, and that's actually your experiment really appealed to me, because there's this waistcoat at the Colonial Museum in Bogota that is made almost entirely of metallic thread, and it's rusty now, so you can't really see it, but there's a flap where you can see that it combines silver and gold colored threads, and so it must have been absolutely beautiful in its heyday. And then if you imagine someone wearing that, which is basically silver and gold, under the coat, because the waistcoat you just see kind of like the front part under the coat, and then in candlelight, for example, it must have looked almost as like saintly as some of the sculptures that we have and as some of the images. And that to me was also kind of part of this elite performance that people engaged with, not just in the portraits that they had painted of themselves, but then also how they fashioned themselves, how they chose to clothe themselves to go into these different spaces of the viceroyalty, into these different, I guess, courtly activities, and that's definitely something that I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm actually trying to convince the people at the museum to let me do this sort of experiment where we can kind of see and photograph how this specific waistcoat would have looked under different kinds of light.
You know, and I'm thinking also in the relevance of the curtains in both religious and civil portraitures. No, of course it changes because it's only one in the civil one, but there's a relationship also there, no, with how these two spaces that we tend to think very separate were actually influencing one another. No, yeah, sí. I think it's just wonderful.
Sí, en el caso de las esculturas que veíamos de Leslie, cuando uno las observa, piensas, bueno, ¿por qué tanto oro? ¿Por qué sobrecargar de decoración estas esculturas? Y se nos olvida que forman parte de un ritual y que forman parte de lo que ahora llamaríamos un performance. Uh-huh. Están dentro del rito. Y esto que mencionaban ahorita de la luz, que no es la misma de hoy, y que tiene un efecto teatral a la hora de, pues de las representaciones, en este caso serían religiosas, pero podrían ser presentaciones en la corte o en cualquier puesta en escena, de un potentado novohispano, mm-hmm. granadino, etc.
Marta is saying that when we look at these sculptures, we may ask why so much gold, but they were part of the decoration, and it was very important for the ritual aspects of it, and she says something that I say every time that I have people in the galleries. The Catholic ritual is really like a modern performance, no? Because you have all these different elements. And that's why in Painted Cloth, and I'm really sad that we're not all together seeing it, but we, on the display, I placed an image of the Mass of St. Gregory from the Barbosa Stern collection on the back, and on the front, I have a chasuble. And on the side, I have a painted altar frontal, because I wanted to convey to the audiences, to our public, that these objects were how these objects were actually used. No, because we in an art museum we absolutely lose all the contextual settings, no, and as Marta was saying, it's super important. And Marta, you also said, no, that these performative practices also happened in the other rituals, no, the rituals of the court and other areas, and I think it's just crucial for us to remember all this.
Yeah, that was
we
really
have a very shy audience in this second session, so it gives us opportunity to talk more among us, but I encourage our audience to bring us questions.
Well, in response to Martha's comment, thinking about the performance and the ritual and kind of that original viewing experience was so important to me, understanding the sculptures and the use of textiles on the sculptures better, because, they're sumptuous materials. And when St. John the Baptist goes and gets rid of all his worldly goods to go into the desert, one of the things that he gets rid of are textiles. And so I was thinking, it seems very contradictory to use that on these religious sculptures, but then when you think about that original context and kind of the importance of keeping them suspended between us and the heavens as this kind of gateway, and the rituals involved around the sculptures, then it's not contradictory at all. And in addition to just upholding the holiness and decorum of the figures themselves.
And Elena is asking if there were examples of dresses donated to the church to make the vestments for sacred statues, which was a practice that happened all over Europe. Which would also be another way in which these two realms were completely being shared. So I don't know if you want to answer that.
I'm not sure. I don't know if that was happening in Latin America, because most of my research focuses on these works where the textiles are painted. So I'm less familiar with the sculptures that are physically dressed. So I don't know if Martha or Laura, if y'all know more about that.
Sobre la conservación de
No, lo que preguntan es si tú tienes evidencia de que mujeres donaran sus vestidos para vestir a las imágenes de culto.
Es el caso que acabo de mencionar de Micaela Josefa Malo. Ella, una vez que tomó el hábito, se presentó con ese traje exuberante, un traje de 1,000 pesos. Estamos hablando de que un esclavo valía 200 pesos, un esclavo joven en edad de trabajo y reproductiva, y este traje que va a usar una sola vez costaba 1,000 pesos. Una vez que ella entra al convento, dona esta enorme cantidad de tela, como vimos en la descripción, de tisú de oro, aterciopelado, en color rojo, lleno de cintas de Milán. Va a ser usado para los ornamentos litúrgicos del propio templo en donde ella va a entrar. Ese es un ejemplo documental, pero tenemos otros de prendas conservadas.
She is saying that this particular woman that she talked about in her presentation, it's very well documented how she had this very lavish, huge dress made to be used only one time, and that the price it was valued was over 1,000 pesos, which at the time was very a huge amount of money, and that we know that it was later used for the creation of vestments of that same convent that she was entering. We need to run a little bit. We have two more questions. Anya Adriva, would you say the exuberance of the gold and silver metal embroidery has also to do with a show of artistic merit as well as level of patronage on behalf of those who commissioned the work? And the other question by Anne Matlock, I would be interested in learning more about the translation of 18th century European textiles to the New World. Were there styles that were preferred? What about the bizarre silks? And Nina Gad says, do we know from other sources the importance of gold and light, which have come up here as an important aspects in these articles of clothing and of sculpture used for religious purposes? So they're asking about sources, which I think the Bible in itself, it's full of references to the aesthetic power, of gold, and as a symbol of divine action, and I think Elena, or I don't know, also talked about this shared symbolism of gold, in both in cultures living in the Americas prior the Spanish invasion. But I don't know if you can talk about the translation of 18th century European textiles to the New World, which I imagine you know a lot, Marta. And about the artistic merit, because I think it's interesting also that maybe it was a way in which artists wanted to talk about their own skill as artists, not only because of the symbolism that it carried, but I think it's a very interesting question. Leslie, Laura?
I definitely think that being able to show off artistic skill, whether in the kind of delicacy with which the sculptures are carved, Quitanian sculpture is really remarkable, and they often have their mouths open with teeny tiny little teeth, like this incredible dexterity of the sculptors. And thinking of that kind of extending to the gold and the artistic merit of the painting, and all these different styles. I do think that was an important aspect of the sculptures, and I think that was part of what kept them kind of in that balance between fiction and reality. That was kind of one of the extra grounding aspects that keeps us as viewers thinking about them not just as religious objects, but also as art objects. And I think that was an important part of that suspension for them as religious devotional works.
And I think we could say the same about metallic thread and like the gold and silver in portraits and in representations of dress. I think more generally, because it also happens in sculptures, it has to do with showing artistic merit. It might also have to do with maybe even like the close relationship between the artist and the subjects depicted too, because there might have been something about, like the the ability of the artist to depict nature as making them like better artists in a way. And you can also tell that from the depictions of textiles more generally, because they are very intricate, very delicate at times. And if you look closely, which I know it's not as easy with like a virtual presentation like we showed, but if you do have access to the paintings or even very high quality photographs of these paintings and you zoom them in, you see the amazing detail with which the textiles and especially lace sometimes and like metallic threads are painted. And that does show, like, if they're not, I don't think artists were going to dedicate as much effort into that if it wasn't important to them and if it didn't add to their own merit and status as artists.
And that's the whole idea of art or painting in a specific as an based on mimesis, and artifice, which is why we were asked to talk and to gather today. It's already 3:02, and I know we still want to keep on talking about this, but I want to wrap up, and I want to just thank you, Leslie, Laura, Marta, for this conversation. Of course, we would not be here without Justin, who helped us all with the technology, and with Holly O'Connell, who also helped us coordinate the gathering of all the information, and for all other things that we needed for this symposium to happen. Thank you so much for the audience for being here for this long session. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. I learned a lot. And if you can, you are always welcome in Austin to see in person Painter's Cloth and to continue these conversations about the depiction of textiles and artistic practice in general. Thank you so much. It was really a privilege. Thank you, Elena.
Congratulations for the exhibition.
Yes, thank you so much. When does the exhibition close?
January 8th next year. So if you happen to be here, if you can travel for the break, that would be fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.